So reading to the next chapter with excerpts from Seth. It's from Jane Roberts' book, Seth-Dreams and Projections of Consciousness. In chapter 6, some advice from Seth. Okay, so I'm going to start with the beginning of this chapter. This is not Seth, this is Jane. So it says, on January 17th, Rob and I tried another experiment together. This time we decided not to have any format or particular plans, but to leave ourselves open to whatever might happen. Before long, I began to speak for a personality called Malba Bronson, who told Rob that she had died in South Dakota in 1946 at the age of 46. The session lasted for a half an hour. My voice was halting with many pauses. I sat there in the darkened room, hearing the voices as if it came from a great distance, feeling a mild astonishment. Malba insisted that she was the same girl I saw die in Lebanshire, England, in my early trance, except that her death had taken place when she was 14, not 17, as I had reported. That's from the previous chapter. She told Rob that our work with Seth was a lifetime project, that we would publish his manuscripts and help spread his ideas. She also informed Rob that I could contact the deceased for their living relatives if I wanted to, emphasizing that a good deal of trial and error would be involved as both of us learned to use our psychic abilities. I was less than impressed with Malba and with the session. For one thing, I distrusted the prediction that the Seth material would be published. It sounds too melodramatic, I said. The Seth material will be published and you'll help the world. It's too much. We've only had 16 sessions. I'm not some poor deluded idiot with the idea that I can solve the world's problems. And Malba didn't sound terribly bright. At least Seth is intelligent and knows what he's talking about. But what's the use in speaking for anyone else? This way, I'm trying to figure out if Seth is independent or not, and worrying about a Malba too. Rob says, you wanted to experiment tonight. I know, but I didn't particularly want to speak for someone else. I wanted something that I could observe too. When I'm in trance, well, that's it. We've only been at this a little over a month, Rob said. Aren't you rushing things a bit? Well, I certainly don't want to contact anyone's dead relatives, I said angrily. Okay, just hang on, it's getting to the good stuff. Oh, that's what the sense of outrage is about, Rob said. He was really laughing now, and I sulked. I realized he was right the moment he spoke. She didn't say you had to, only that you could if you wanted to. See what Seth has to say about Malba in our next session. I'll ask him to comment if he doesn't on his own. Actually, Seth opened the 17th session with a brief mention of the affair, saying, okay, so here's Seth. I'll go along with your little joke about Malba, toast of the midplane. Malba of the midplane was your apt description. Rob had made a remark earlier. The midplane is indeed an excellent description of the semi-plane which she now inhabits. It is a waiting plane for personalities at certain stages of development. The midplane contains a conglomeration of fragments who have not attained sufficient knowledge or manipulability to progress further at this point. They may be at various stages of development, but usually they have attained only a fair level of achievement. They have not excelled, neither have they failed. They are working out problems of their own. They are not as yet committed to the next plane of their advancement. They can be of benefit along certain lines. The validity of their information may be excellent. On the other hand, it may be less than trustworthy at times, simply because their achievement level is not high. If they err, they do so through ignorance. Okay, so now Jane writes, the entire session ran 3 hours, and most of it was devoted to the ego and the subconscious, and to their relationship to health and illness. While Rob's back was vastly improved since Seth's reincarnational sessions for him, he still had some bad days now and then. We'd been in the habit of blaming difficulties on the subconscious. Okay, so Seth says to Rob, the ego is the tool by which the hidden self manipulates in the physical universe. In your case, it enables you to focus your artistic ability along lines necessary to make it effective on your plane. However, when the ego becomes involved with fears, it ceases to be an effective tool and becomes instead a hammer hitting you incessantly over the head. When the ego becomes overly concerned, it becomes overly conditioned to negative responses. The creative energies build up their thickly dimensioned pseudo-realities of pain. For a certain amount of time, according to your condition, they automatically create the patterns of fear that belong to the ego. These fears do not belong to what you think of as the subconscious. Then these materializations of panic and pain play about the physical body projected by the ego and steal the powers of the subconscious mind from their natural constructive tasks. In other words, the ego becomes a tool to disrupt rather than to create. Your own subconscious is the fountain of your individuality and personality. From it springs your talent. When the ego becomes too concerned with daily matters with worry, then it becomes far less effective. The freely working subconscious, or the inner you, is completely capable of taking care of all practical considerations and will use the ego as a tool to do so. Dissociation puts the power back where it belongs. Daily methods of dissociation are extremely practical. You will notice within a few weeks' time an added energy. So-called impulses on your part are often blocked because you do not consider them practical. But the subconscious knows its own meat and its own sauce, and the best means for its nourishment. Begin the yoga exercises and follow them faithfully. Your few experiments with autosuggestion upon falling asleep have been ego-bound. Think of this in terms of muscle-bound, and you will see what I mean. Be in a drowsy state and suggest, Rupert. Suggest, Joseph. Do not attempt to bully or command the subconscious. Okay, he adds to Rob, my affection for you is strong. If I speak heavy-handedly, it is because I want you to have a light touch. Dissociation brings about a strong unity with the creative aspects of personality. It puts you back, or it puts your creative talents back in the driver's seat. Okay, now Jane writes, following Seth's suggestions, Rob began doing a few simple yoga exercises, and the night before the 18th session, he used self-hypnosis to relax his muscles. The results were so immediate and excellent, and Rob was so limp when he finished that both of us were amused. He looked so like a before and after advertisement. Before he began the exercises, he was very uptight, with sore muscles and a repressive body pose. Afterward, he was like some happy rag doll. Seth began to comment on this in the beginning of the next session. As usual, he used our personal experience as a basis for some excellent information with great general application. All right, I'm going to paraphrase here. So, they're starting the session with the Ouija board, and almost at once, Jane began to hear Seth mentally, and after taking a few words through the board, she sets it aside, stood up, and began to speak for Seth as she paced about the room. Okay, so Rob says, what did you think of my performance last night? Seth says, very good, if you're referring to the hypnosis session. Your condition following this and your first exercise bout should show you how badly you were in need of treatment. When I suggested that you dissociate incidentally, I didn't mean that you should break up into pieces. At times, the ego can hold you in a tight vice, which the dissociation breaks. This is what happened after your exercises. You have been doing very well in allowing yourself psychic freedom. However, conscious fears cause the ego to tighten its grasp, and some effects of this nature were starting up. This is why I suggested the exercises at this time. The fact that the fearful ego was beginning to tighten explains your reaction to the exercises. The ego can build up around the inner self like a glacier, and the exercises help melt it away. Even the prickles in your neck are like tiny picks chipping away at icy fears. You were released so quickly as a result of the exercises that you didn't know what had happened. Incidentally, while we are on the subject, often when you thought you were dealing with a matter or a person in a dissociated manner, you were instead exhibiting a cold, conscious detachment. This is a pose of the ego and is not to be confused with the lithe subconscious detachment, which is actually warm, flexible, and expansive. As to Jane's feelings about the tree having a certain consciousness, of course this is the case. What you have here is latent energy, vitality, and capacity, with much of it withheld or suspended momentarily. The tree is dissociated in one manner. In some ways, its living forces and consciousness are kept to a minimum. It is in a state of drowsiness on the one hand, and on the other, it focuses the usable portion of its energy into being a tree. Okay, let me just pause. Some of this stuff is from the Seth material, because if you don't know this, let me just tell you real quick. This book was not published initially when she wrote it. So, it was published after she died. Anyways, so he goes on. The state of consciousness involved here is dull as compared to the highly differentiated human ability in many ways. However, in other ways, the experiences of the tree are extremely deep, dealing with the inner senses, which are also properties of treedom. The inner senses of the tree have strong affinity with the properties of earth itself. They feel their growing. They listen to their growing as you might listen to your own heartbeat. They experience this oneness with their own growth, and they also feel pain. The pain, while definite, unpleasant, and sometimes agonizing, is not of an emotional nature in the same way that you experience pain. In some ways, it is even a deeper thing. The analogy may not be perfect, far from it, but it is as if your breath were to be suddenly cut off. In a manner, this somewhat approximates pain for a tree. The tree makes adjustments just as you do. It listens to its own growth up from the earth and to the murmur of the growth of its roots beneath. It adjusts each root ending according to what impediments might lie in its way. Without the conscious mind of man, it nevertheless retains this inner consciousness of all its parts, above and below the ground, and manipulates them constantly. The tree is also aware of its environment to an astonishing degree. It maintains constant awareness of the ability to adjust itself in two completely different worlds, so to speak. One in which it meets little resistance in growing upward, and one composed of much heavier elements into which it must grow downward. Man needs artificial methods to operate effectively on land or in water, but the so-called unconscious tree manages nicely in two worlds as diverse, certainly, as land and water, and makes itself a part of each. And as far as motion is concerned, the tree moves upward and downward. It is quite unfair to say that it cannot transport itself, since it does so to an amazing degree. The roots and limbs moving in all directions. The inner senses of all plant life are well attuned, alert, and very vital. All of these fragments have consciousness to a rather high degree, considering that man holds them to such low repute. If you remember what you know of the trance state in a light trance, you are able to maintain awareness of self, your environment, and your place in it. You simply behave somewhat differently, not bestirring yourself in any direction unless the suggestion to do so has been given. The awareness of plant life lies along these lines. Now, in a deep trance, the subject, though fully aware of what is happening in the trance, may remember nothing of it afterward. The awareness of plant life is also somewhat like that of the subject in deep trance. Except for the suggestion and stimulus received by regular natural forces on your plane, the plant life does not bestir itself in other directions. But like the trance subject, our plant is aware. Its other abilities lie unused for the time and latent, but they are present. The awareness is focused along certain lines. The tree lives through its inner senses, experiencing many sensations and reacting to many stimuli of which you are unaware. Minute earth tremors, even the motion of small ants about its lower trunk. These are recognized and experienced. Such invisibilities as humidity, radioactivity, and all electrical values are felt as quite real things to your tree. A tree knows a human being also by the weight of a boy upon its branches, by the vibrations in the air as adults pass, which hit the tree's trunk at varying distances, and even by voices. You must remember what I said earlier about mental enzymes, and my remark that color can sometimes be heard. The tree recognizes a human being, though it does not see the human being in your terms. It does not build up the image of a man, but it builds up a composite sensation which represents, say, a given individual, and the tree will recognize the same man who passes by it each day. As your own body senses temperature changes, it also senses the psychic charge, not only of other individuals, but of plant and vegetative matter. Your tree builds up a composite of sensations of this sort, sensing not the physical dimensions of a material object, whatever it is, but the vital psychic formation within it and about it. Size is sensed by a tree, however, perhaps because of its inherent concern with height. The table around which Rupert walks senses Rupert, even as he senses it. Man's ego causes him to interpret everything else in light of himself. He loses much in this manner. The ego can be compared to the bark of a tree. The bark is flexible, vibrant, and grows with the growth beneath. It is a tree's contact with the outer world, the tree's interpreter, and, to some degree, the tree's companion. So should man's ego be. When man's ego turns instead into a shell, when instead of interpreting outside conditions, it reacts too violently against them, then it hardens and becomes an imprisoning form that begins to snuff out important data and to keep enlarging information from the inner self. The ego's purpose is protective. The ego is also a device to enable the inner self to inhabit the physical plane. If, for example, our tree bark grew fearful of stormy weather and began to harden itself against the elements, in a well-meaning but distorted protective spirit, then the tree would die. This is what the ego does when it reacts too violently to purely physical data. As a result, it stiffens, and then you have, my well-meaning friend, the cold detachment with which you at one time faced the world. The idea of dissociation could be likened to the slight distance between the bark and the inside of the tree. Here we do not have a rigid bark, as you should not have a rigid ego. We have instead a flexible bark, changing with the elements, protecting the inner tree or inner self, but flexible, opening or closing in rhythmic motion. The inner tree can continue to grow because the bark is resilient. It bends with the wind. It does not bend when there is no wind, nor does it stiffen, stopping the flow of sap to the treetop for fear that the dumb tree, not knowing what it was up to, would bump its head against the sky. Neither should the ego react so violently that it remembers and reacts to past storms in the midst of clear and sunny weather. You can understand the analogy, Joseph. You know that such a tree bark would be death to the tree. What you must still understand is that the same applies to any individual and the ego. It applies to you. And Rupert must learn that it is equally ridiculous to act as if it is a summer day in the middle of wintertime. The tree has enough sense not to show blossoms in a blizzard. At times, Joseph, you have not trusted your ego's ability to protect you. You have forced it into anxiety so that it overcompensated trying to protect you, and it ended up half choking you to death. That's all I'm going to read from that chapter. And the next chapter is chapter 7, the inner senses, more on mental enzymes. Okay, so Seth carries his discussion on the inner senses further and gives clues on how to use them. So this is what he says. Seth said, "Your scientists are correct in supposing that the universe is composed of the same elements that can be found in your plane. However, the elements that they know are, of course, camouflage patterns that may show themselves in a completely different form somewhere else. The elements, those that you now know, and those you will create, are camouflages of the basic stuff or vitality which you cannot discover with your outer senses. Your scientists will find that their tools are no longer adequate because man has such a sense of curiosity. Scientists will be forced finally to use the inner senses. Otherwise, they will be dealing with camouflage only and find themselves in a blind alley, not because their eyes are closed, but because they are not using the right set of eyes. The camouflage is necessary at this stage of development, intricate, complicated, various, and beyond the understanding of the outer senses, which are the perceptors of the camouflage itself, peculiarly adapted to see under particular circumstances. It is only the inner senses that will give you any evidence at all of the basic nature of life. Since very often the vitality or stuff of the universe seems as innocuous as air, then look for what you do not see. Explore places that seem empty, for they are full. Look between events. What you see clearly with the outer senses is camouflage. I am not suggesting that you take all of this on faith. I am saying that what seems vacant lacks camouflage, and therefore, if this is explored, it will yield evidence. Effects would seem to be evidence. In concrete terms, if a tree branch moves, then you take it for granted that something blows it. You know wind by its effects. No one has seen wind, But since its effects are so observable, it will be idiocy to say that it did not exist. Therefore, you will come up against the basic stuff of the universe and feel its effects, though your physical senses will not necessarily perceive it. Granted, camouflage is, in itself, an effect. If you look at the observable world, you can learn something about the inner one, but only if you take into consideration the existence of camouflage distortion. There is so much to be said here, and you have so much to learn, that sometimes I have to admit that I'm appalled. Your own experience with creativity should help you out here. When you paint a picture, my dear Joseph, you are dealing with a transformation of energy and transformation of camouflage pattern. There is a brief but vital moment when you are dealing with the underlying vitality of which I have spoken. You are forced to transform this creative energy into another camouflage pattern because of your earthly situation. There is nothing else you can do. But for this moment, you pluck this vitality from the inner senses. Then you transform it into a somewhat different, more evocative, new camouflage pattern that is, nevertheless, more fluid than the usual pattern, and gives greater freedom and mobility to the vitality itself. You approach a transmigration of plane. A certain distortion must be expected. The painting, however, achieves a certain freedom from camouflage, although it cannot escape it, and actually hovers between realities in a way that no thoroughly camouflaged object could do. Music and poetry also can achieve this state. Seth went on to explain that the more camouflage, or physical dimensions, an art object had, the less its validity to the inner senses. Alright, and then Seth goes on. Your scientists can count their elements, and while they are on the wrong track, they will discover more and more elements until they are ready to go out of their minds. And while they create instruments to deal with smaller and smaller particles, they will see smaller and smaller particles, seemingly without end. As their instruments reach further into the physical universe, they will see further and further, but they will automatically and unconsciously transform what they apparently see into the camouflage patterns with which they are familiar. They will be and are prisoners of their tools. More galaxies will seemingly be discovered, more mysterious radio stars perceived until the scientists realize that something is wrong. Instruments designed to measure the vibrations with which scientists are familiar will be designed and redesigned. All kinds of seemingly impossible phenomena will be discovered with these instruments. The trouble is that the instruments will be designed to catch certain camouflages, and they will perform their function. They themselves transform data from terms you cannot understand into terms that you can understand. This involves a watering down of data, and a simplification that distorts the original information out of shape. The original is hardly discernible when they are done. You are destroying the meaning in the translation. When you decipher one phenomena in terms of another, you always lose sight of whatever glimmer of understanding that may have reached you. It is not a matter of inventing new instruments any longer, but of using the invisible ones you have. These may be known and examined. This material itself is evidence. It is like the branches that move, so that you know the wind by its effects, and a windbag like me by the billowing gale of my monologues. Scientists realize that the atmosphere of the Earth has a distorting effect upon their instruments. What they do not understand is that their instruments themselves are bound to be distortive. Any material instrument will have built-in distortive effects. The one instrument which is more important than any other is the mind, not the brain, the meeting place of the inner and outer senses. The mind is distributed throughout the entire physical body and builds up about it the physical camouflage necessary for existence on the physical level. The mind receives data from the inner senses and forms the necessary camouflage. The brain deals exclusively with camouflage patterns, while the mind deals with basic principles inherent on all planes. The brain is itself part of the camouflage pattern and can be interpreted and probed by physical instruments. The mind cannot. The mind is the connective. It is here that the secrets of the universe will be discovered, and the mind itself is the tool of discovery. You might say that the brain is the mind in camouflage. Imagination belongs to the mind, not the brain. Instruments may be used to force imagination to move along in terms of its own personal memories, but it cannot be forced to move along the lines of conceptual thoughts because the imagination is a connective between the physical individual and the non-physical entity. Mental enzymes, by the way, have a chemical effect or reaction on your plane, but the effect itself is, of course, distortion. On the other planes, the distortion effect may not be chemical at all. As I told you, mental enzymes transform vitality into the particular camouflage patterns. A chemical imbalance in a physical body will also show itself as a corresponding distortion of sensual data. That is, when the chemical balance is disturbed, the physical world will appear to have changed. For the individual involved, the camouflage actually has changed. The subconscious is a property of mind and is, to a large degree, independent of camouflage. While part of the subconscious must deal with camouflage, for example, the deeper portions are in direct contact with the basic vitality of the universe. When you or Rupert wonder if this material comes from your subconscious, you take it for granted that the subconscious is personal, dealing exclusively with matters of your past. You are sometimes willing to concede that perhaps some elements of racial memory might enter in. The subconscious, however, also contains the undistorted material of the mind, which is uncamouflaged and which operates between planes, knowing no boundaries. The sense of sight, mostly concentrated in your eyes, remains fixed in a permanent position in your physical body. Without moving away from the body, the eyes see something that may be far in the distance. In the same manner, the ears hear sounds that are distant from the body. In fact, the ears ordinarily hear sounds from outside the body more readily than sounds inside the body itself. Since the ears are connected to the body and part of it, it would be logical for an open-minded observer to suppose that the ears would be well attuned to the inner sounds to a high degree. This, you know, is not the case. The ears can be trained to some degree into a sound awareness pertaining to the body itself. And breathing, for example, can be magnified to an almost frightening degree when one concentrates upon listening to his own breath. But as a rule, the ears neither listen nor hear the inner sounds of the body. The sense of smell also seems to leap forward. A man can smell quite a stink even though it is not right under his nose. The sense of touch does not seem to leap out in this manner. Unless the hand itself presses upon a surface, then you do not feel that you have touched it. Touch usually involves contact of a direct sort. You can, of course, feel the invisible wind against your cheek, but touch involves an immediacy different from the distant perceptions of sight and smell. I am sure you realize these points yourself. The outer senses deal mainly with camouflage patterns. The inner senses deal with realities beneath camouflage and deliver inner information. These inner senses, therefore, are capable of seeing within the body, though the physical eyes cannot. As the sense of sight, sound, and smell appear to reach outward, bringing data to the body from an outside observable camouflage pattern, so the inside senses seem to extend far inward, bringing inner reality to the body. There is also a transforming process involved, much like the moment that we have spoken about in the creation of a painting. The physical body is a camouflage pattern operating in a larger camouflage pattern, but the body and all camouflage patterns are also transformers of the vital inner stuff of the universe, enabling it to operate under new and various conditions. The inner senses, then, deliver data from the inner world of reality to the body. The outer senses deliver data from the outside world of camouflage to the body. However, the inner senses are aware of the body's own physical data at all times, while the outer senses are concerned with the body mainly in its relationship to camouflage environment. The inner senses have an immediate, constant knowledge of the body in a way that the outer senses do not. The material is delivered to the body from the inner world through the inner senses. This inner data is received by the mind. The mind, being uncamouflaged then, is the receiving station for the data brought to it by the inner senses. What you have here are inner nervous and communication systems, closely resembling the outer systems with which you are familiar. I am repeating myself, but I want this to be clear. This vital data is sent to the mind by the inner senses. Any information that is important to the body's contact with outer camouflage is given to the brain. The so-called subconscious is a connective between mind and brain, between the inner and outer senses. Portions of it deal with camouflage patterns, with the personal past of the present personality, with racial memory. The greater portions of it are concerned with the inner world, and as data reaches it from the inner world, so can these portions of the subconscious reach far into the inner world itself. Rob asks about time. Seth says, time and space are both camouflage patterns. The inner senses conquer time and space, but this is hardly surprising because time and space do not exist for them. There is no time and space. Therefore, nothing is conquered. The camouflage simply is not present. I want to give you more detailed information about inner realities themselves. Actually, they do not parallel the outer senses, and this will sound appalling to you, I'm afraid, simply because there is nothing to be seen, heard, or touched in the manner in which you are accustomed. I don't want to give you the idea that existence without your camouflage pattern is bland and innocuous, because this is not the case. The inner senses have a strong immediacy, a delicious intensity that your outer senses lack. There is no lapse of time in perception, since there is no time. Camouflage patterns do, of course, also belong to the inner world, since they are formed from the stuff of the universe by mental enzymes, which have a chemical reaction on your plane. The reaction is necessarily a distortion. That is, any camouflage is a distortion in the sense that vitality is forced into a particular form. Mental enzymes are actually the property of the inner world, representing the conversion of vitality into camouflage data, which is then interpreted by the physical senses. Okay, here Seth tells Rob to imagine a man looking at a tree in the near distance on an ordinary street with intervening houses and sidewalks. Seth says, using the inner senses, it would be as if instead of seeing the various houses, our man felt them. He would be sensitive to them, in other words, as you feel heat or cold without necessarily touching ice or fire. He would be using the first inner sense. It involves immediate perception of a direct nature, whose intensity varies according to what is being sensed. It involves constant cognition through what I can only describe as inner vibrational touch. This sense would permit our man to feel the basic sensations felt by the tree, so that instead of looking at it, his consciousness would expand to contain the experience of what it is to be a tree. According to his proficiency, he would feel in like manner the experience of being the grass and so forth. He would in no way lose consciousness of who he was, and he would perceive these experiences again somewhat in the same manner that you perceive heat and cold. The inner senses are capable of expansion and of focus in a way unknown to the outer ones, and the inner world, of course, is a part of all realities. It is not so much that it exists simultaneously with the outer world, as that it forms the outer world and exists in it also. When you receive more information on the inner senses, you will begin using them to a much higher degree than you are now. Of course, the inner senses can be used to explore reality that does not yield to the physical senses. Okay, was that not just the coolest chapter? Anyways, Jane writes, this session impressed me quite a bit, since after it I felt much less tired than I had earlier. Where had the extra energy come from? After 3 hours of dictation as Seth? I wondered. Besides this, both of us began to experiment with the first inner sense on the basis of the information we received that night. As you will see, the resulting experiences began to add another dimension to our lives. So the next chapter goes into some experiences with inner senses. And again, I'm not going to read all of it. You guys have to buy this book and study it and read it again and again and again until it clicks. Anyways, thank you for watching.